Today, we're going to do part 2 of our lecture series of Western Skyscrapers of the Gilded Age. Last week, we focused on San Francisco and Los Angeles. Today, the best of the rest of the West. So here we see 2 of the antique skyscrapers I'll tell you about tonight. One of them is in Denver, one of them is in Oakland. But before we get into the skyscrapers, I'd like to do a little bit of history about why there were enough people over there in the West so that there were cities and they needed skyscrapers. So the history of the West, as you folks all know, out there in Monterey, is the history, really, it's a story about mining. So in the first half of the 19th century, there were very, very few people who lived in the West. This is an 1845 travel guide called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. And it reported that the entire population of California then was about 31,000 people. And that's 20,000 Native Americans, or Native inhabitants, 10,000 Mexicans who were the people in possession of the land at the time, 1,000 foreigners, as this book puts it. In other words, people from America, because of course the West was part of Mexico in 1845. But a year after this publication, we went to war with Mexico. And when it was over, now the West belonged to the United States. And I find it interesting that war it had its bloody engagements, mostly in what's now Mexico, but not in California. California, it was a gentle affair for the most part. The US Navy only had about 400 Marines and sailors. And I think only a couple of warships really along the West Coast, but they were able with that tiny force to basically walk into each of the tiny garrisons of Mexican residents along the coasts in Monterey, the capital, as you all know, of Alta California, but also Yerba Buena, which would be San Francisco, San Diego, and Pueblo de Los Angeles. And it basically took California without firing a shot. And when the war was over, what did we do with all of this new land? Not much at first. In fact, in 1848, the total number of ships from the East Coast that landed in San Francisco at the harbor, 4 for a year. Now, that changed pretty dramatically the next year in 1849. It wasn't, by the way, the first gold rush that America had ever had. They had one in Georgia, for example, but this was a huge gold rush and people came in astounding numbers. In fact, there you see a cartoon of a typical gold rush prospector from the 49 gold rush. He's walking to California with his gear strapped on his back. And that wasn't the fastest way. A faster way was this. Not a lot faster. It took about 4 or 5 months in a clipper ship to go from the East Coast to San Francisco. But in the first year of the gold rush, more than 60,000 people sailed around Cape Horn to San Francisco. That's, if you think about it, double the full population of California from that tour guide, which said 31,000 20 years ago. Now, typically you'd start that journey in the fall. You'd round Cape Horn, round the Horn in January, which is winter here, but in the Southern Hemisphere is summertime, and then up to San Francisco by the springtime. But not only was this a long journey, it was treacherous. This is a painting from 1851 of prospectors, hopefuls, coming around Cape Horn. This is an incident where 2 clipper ships almost crashed into each other. And you can see where the Atlantic and Pacific meet right there on the coast of Antarctica. The seas can get pretty rough. And keep that in mind. That's how much people wanted gold. But of course, that sailing voyage was not a long-term solution. So there was a massive federal project that started during the Civil War to link California to the east with a railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad. And this was done by basically 2 big companies. The Union Pacific was coming from the Mississippi Valley, from Missouri, and headed west across the plains. The Central Pacific started in Sacramento and came through the Sierra Nevada mountains. So they had the harder route. This was extremely hard work, in fact. Luckily, by the 1860s, there were a lot more people living in California that they could hire to do this work. And in 1868, as a matter of fact, 80% of the payroll of the Central Pacific, of their workforce, were Chinese immigrant laborers, about 12,000 of them. Why were they there? Well, back when the gold rush started, it was easier to get to California sailing from China than from New York, and they'd come just like everyone else in great numbers, hoping to strike it rich in the gold rush. And like most of the people who came for the gold rush, they didn't. Most of them didn't strike it rich. Only a few lucky guys found gold. The rest of them had to figure out some other gig. So in fact, tonight's talk is going to feature several people who have a similar story that tried to strike it rich in a gold rush and had to find an alternative form of making their fortune. This is a painting by a Chinese American artist from the 1950s that shows workers on the Central Pacific line blasting away the Sierra Nevadas hanging down from baskets along the mountainside, building a trestle across a valley. Now, if you think this was a big project, try this. In 1904, the US took possession of the unfinished French Panama Canal. So the work they'd been abandoned for a decade. And so began a massive project, even bigger than that railroad had been. And up in San Francisco, which was the West Coast's biggest city, people are thrilled. And they started to plan to celebrate. Once that Panama Canal was open, they would have a great World's Fair, like in Chicago and Buffalo and other places. So even after the earthquake in 1906, the city leaders did not give up on this idea of a fair. And in 1915, when the Panama Canal had finally opened, in fact, this is a picture of one of the first ships going through it, San Francisco hosted a World's Fair called the Panama Pacific International Exposition of 1915. And just like in Chicago in 1893, or Buffalo in 1901, or St. Louis in 1904, they built a huge fairground, mostly temporary exhibit buildings. And in the center there, if you look, you'll see here, I'll circle it a little bit. That's the Tower of Jewels. Buffalo had pioneered the idea of a tower of electric light bulbs in 1901. In San Francisco, they were colored lights. And on the left also of this image, you'll see the Palace of Fine Arts. You might recognize that. Again, like most World Fairs, most of the buildings in the World's Fairs were temporary constructions and they were demolished at the end. But the Palace of Fine Arts remains today. It was rebuilt and you can visit it. It's quite lovely in that Beaux-Arts style. By the way, the more I looked into World's Fairs, the more I wondered, what did you do at a World's Fair? What did you look at? So here, how about a Tower of Pickles? That's a display from Heinz. And I show my prejudice as a Pittsburgher. Heinz is a Pittsburgh company. Another popular thing was looking at flying demonstrations. So what you see here is Lincoln Beachey, who's a San Francisco native and an internationally famous barnstormer who does stunts and loops all over the country, and people come to his air shows. So here, one of the marvelous things that Lincoln Beachey did at the San Francisco World's Fair, actually just before it opened, was they hauled a wooden mock-up imitation battleship, the USS Oregon, basically a model of it, full size, out into the, anchored it offshore in the harbor and packed it full of explosives. And then Lincoln Beachey flew his biplane, which you see here, over the battleship and dipped down like he was bombing it. He was dropping bombs on it. And the battleship exploded and all these dramatic explosions went off and the crowd was excited and thrilled or scared, depending. And I'm not sure if that's, I don't think that's it here in the photo we're looking at. I don't believe that's a picture, but this is before, it's happened before the fair actually opened. And this is before the fair opened. You can see there's scaffolding around one of the pieces of construction here. Actually, when the fair opened, Beachy, for his first performance in March of 1915, wanted to show off a new plane he devised, which was a mono-wing plane rather than this biplane in the image. Unfortunately, uh, he lost control while he was doing his stunts, and the wings broke off, and his fuselage plunged into the bay, and he drowned strapped into his aircraft. And they finally fished him out hours later, but it was too late for Lincoln. That really wasn't the biggest problem that they faced, though, at the San Francisco World's Fair. Daredevil pilots having a fatal crash in the bay. The problem they really were dealing with was a rival World's Fair, or a rival expo, just down the coast in Southern California in San Diego. What's this about? Tiny little San Diego. Their population was a tenth the size of San Francisco. By far the smallest city that ever asked to have a World's Fair. And in fact, they were not allowed to have a World's Fair. They had an international expo, but it didn't get to use that branding of World's Fair. But anyway, they went ahead and did it in 1915, the same year that San Francisco was having a major international exposition. And to do it, they built something called Balboa Park, which they named after the first European explorer to cross North America to the Pacific. And instead of the Beaux-Arts style that all the World's Fairs had used up to that point, the new form of monumental architecture, the marriage of combination of Greek and Roman and Renaissance styles, they used a very extreme Spanish Baroque, which also is called Churrigueresque, or California Churrigueresque, after a Spanish architect. You can still see the buildings in Balboa Park now. They're splendid. They've been either rebuilt or preserved. And Hollywood didn't want to pick one or the other, so they covered both. They sent a pair of their most bankable comedy stars to both of these expos, Roscoe, or Fatty Arbuckle, as we know him, and Mabel Normand. Arbuckle had been discovered. He was a singing waiter, and he was discovered by none other than Sid Grauman from our last talk, the owner of the $1 Million Theater in LA. Mabel Normand is also a major person in film history. She was the first person ever to throw a custard pie in a movie. And I think she might have been the first person also to get hit by a custard pie in a movie. She was the first woman to be chained to a railroad track in a movie. But she did some more consequential things as well. She was a director of several movies, and she was the star and the director of the first movie where Charlie Chaplin appeared as his tramp character. And many folks say she kind of taught him the ropes and taught him some of his moves to become the star of comedy and slapstick that he eventually became. And those two are black and white images, or movie stills. The first one, they're touring the San Francisco Fair with the mayor. That's a pretty boring comedy, frankly. Both of these are you can find them on YouTube. But the one on the bottom is from their tour of the San Diego Expo, and it's terrific. It's a great slapstick movie. I highly recommend looking it up and watching it. This one, they're in a chase scene, riding around in these electric wicker carts that were a fixture of the fair. Now, how did San Diego manage to pull off an international expo at the same time its much bigger neighbor was doing one in the north? Two things, really. First of all, it had a brand new giant luxury hotel where all the guests could stay and they could hold the gala events and so forth. And they also had a famous name attached to the event, and that name is Ulysses S. Grant. That was the president of the committee to plan and do the San Diego Fair, Ulysses S. Grant Jr. So Ulysses S. Grant Jr. was the president's second son. He went by the name Buck. And Buck was building the biggest hotel in town. Now, I realize nowadays it is very hard to even imagine a president's son trying to cash in on the name of his famous father, especially in the hotel business. That's almost unimaginable. So maybe I'll offer you the backstory for Buck. The Buck story. Back when his dad was president, Buck Grant, he went to Harvard, Then he went to Columbia Law School. He became an assistant U.S. attorney. And he set up an investment firm with a Wall Street banker named Ferdinand Ward. Grant and Ward, it was called. And he got his dad to pull in savings. He put in his own savings. Unfortunately, Ward was a swindler. This was a Ponzi scheme. And as a result, the Grants were financially ruined. The former president, to add insult to injury, this is in the 1880s, then discovered he had terminal throat cancer. Now, the story has something of a happy ending. Mark Twain, out of loyalty and admiration for Ulysses S. Grant, the former president, helped him to get his memoirs published. And just before he died of throat cancer. And so the memoirs sold so well that Grant's widow and his children, including Buck, got wealthy again off the sales of the memoir. Now, Buck probably wanted to skip town for reasons already mentioned. His wife, Fanny, was in poor health too. So they moved to San Diego for the climate. And this was just, the resort was just starting out at this time in the 1890s. They bought an old San Diego hotel, the first hotel of the city, and they tore it down to build a huge hotel at Broadway and 4th to cash in on the public's love of U.S. Grant. They would name it the Grant Hotel and theme it against, or theme it on U.S. Grant, the president. So it was a presidential hotel, and it's very exclusive. The San Diego Tribune at the time, at its opening, you can see it here. In the story, it says, "It will be there that the elite of this city will gather for cotillions, bridge, receptions, balls, and bazaars." And it's not shy about its exclusivity. The hotel will be monopolized by the wealthy citizens of this city, but there is every indication that no favorites will be played by the management and that the hotel will be open at all times to all residents of this city who have the time and means to gratify the cravings of the senses in this beautiful structure. I love old newspaper writing. So we look at this picture, and I promised this was going to be about skyscrapers. And frankly, I understand that that doesn't look very tall. And now is where I confess that in my book, where I limited it to buildings of 10 stories or taller, I kind of cheated here. Now, the building is 11 stories tall, but that's because they added a couple stories a few decades after the opening. When it first opened, it was 9 stories tall. So that kind of misses the cutoff, but you kind of bend the rules when there's a good story. And this is a good one. And even though it doesn't really look tall to us, it really dominated the skyline of San Diego when it opened. This is a view from the roof of the Grant Hotel down 4th Street, or 4th Avenue, I think, to the harbor. And so you can see it's clearly the biggest thing in San Diego when it opened in 1910. Now in the far distance, past the harbor, right here, you can see just a faint bump in the outline of the strip. That's the beach there. That's the Hotel del Coronado, which is the first major San Diego resort hotel. 1888 construction. It's a little bit too far though for the World's Fairgrounds, so in Balboa Park. I mentioned it because one of the main investors there was John Spreckels, who we met last week, the German immigrant family that were sugar refiners in San Francisco. Spreckels turned out to be more interested in San Diego than San Francisco, even though for a time they owned a major newspaper, The Call. So he's seen as the father of San Diego. And the Grant Hotel played up on that presidential connection for all it was worth. They had an original oil painting of President Grant hanging at the top of the grand staircase, and it's still there now. This is from my visit last year. You can see that it has been outfitted with protection against coronavirus. The main dining room was called the Bivouac Grill, and it had murals of Civil War battles on the wall. If you look at that top photo too, you can see they had military-style tent encampments on the roof. And the hotel has one additional connection to President Grant, but that one is much more recent. So on the left, you see an illustration from about 1850 of a family from the Kumeyaay tribe, the Kumeyaay people. who were the original inhabitants of that part of California. And on the right, from the lobby of the hotel, are some more modern portraits of the Kumeyaay people. And so some background, when Grant was president, the Kumeyaay had been trying already for decades to get the US government to protect their ancestral land there because the settlers coming in were claiming it all for farms. So in 1870, right at the start of President Grant's term, he signed an executive order to create a reservation for the Kumeyaay that was 46,000 acres, basically the whole San Pasqual Valley, which is there where they live mostly near Escondido today. But the settlers hated this. It caused an outrage. And so, like any politician, Grant backtracked immediately. And in 1871, he rescinded this order. And eventually, a few years later, his administration created some reservations for the Kumeyaay. But it was a patchwork, most of them in arid land, poor soil. The Sicuan band got 1 square mile, and that is 2/3 of it on the side of a mountain. So almost totally useless. But the part that isn't on a mountain today has a 12-story casino on it. And so in 2003, the Sicuan band of the Kumeyaay people bought the Grant Hotel, and they own it now. And that's why their pictures are hanging in the lobby. Here's one of the most elegant antique skyscrapers. We saw it in the opening as girders. This is Oakland City Hall. In 1914, that's when it was built. We saw the Los Angeles City Hall. This is the first skyscraper city hall ever built. And the person who pushed it through was the mayor of Oakland, Frank Mott. And the people called it Mayor Mott's wedding cake because during the construction, this mayor, who was a bachelor, surprised everyone by marrying a school teacher from Berkeley named Gertrude Bennett. You can see the coverage there in Oakland. Mott had started out as a hardware store owner. Then he was a city councilman. He was a mayor for 10 years, and he was in office when the 1906 earthquake hit. So suddenly, Oakland had to deal with 150,000 refugees from San Francisco, which is twice the population of Oakland. And Mott was really great in a crisis. So he made sure they were all clothed, or rather sheltered and fed while they were in Oakland. And really it endeared him to many. And many of them ended up staying in Oakland, building that city up more. And when he asked the public a few years later to support a bond issue to build a city hall in a skyscraper, he got overwhelming support, and so it was done. And I want to draw your attention to an interesting architectural feature of this skyscraper in Oakland, and that is those slit windows along the top floor. What are those? It turns out this city hall has all the important city hall elements, including a jail. So those are holding cells. And the slits are windows to let in light, although right as of now, they appear to be closed up, have been closed up for some time. And people sometimes ask if I got arrested when I was doing the research for this book for trespassing. So this is the closest I came to getting locked up. You can see the window, the slit window behind me. These are actually, it's not a jail anymore. Since the 60s, it hasn't been a jail. It's used for storage, and it's not actually accessible to the public. So you can see a picture of Mott there on the left in the derby hat with workers that are putting some terracotta on the construction as they build it. It's a really lovely detailed building in a white granite, almost seems to shade to pink in the sunlight. And you can see some of the details there of the picture I took on the way in. There were figs and grapes and olives, and that's all to represent the agricultural bounty of Oakland. And the interior is pretty spectacular as well. And here I have to speak up as a Pittsburgher again. The building is by Henry Hornbostel. So he was an architect originally in New York, but here in Pittsburgh, Andrew Carnegie wanted a trade school built. And so he hired Hornbostel to design it, or Hornbostel's design one. And so Hornbostel came out and built what is now called Carnegie Mellon University, which is a worldwide recognized school for technology. Folks in your neck of the woods out there in California maybe have heard about CMU. So Hornbostel actually founded the School of Architecture at CMU and stayed there as a professor for the rest of his career here in Pittsburgh, but he still took on commissions to design buildings. And have a look at these decorations of the city council chambers. And even more interestingly, that chandelier, the original chandelier outside, you can see there's a sculpted ring, and that's portraying the battle of the gods versus the Titans. But what really captivates me most of all is this disco ball that appears to be 60 years ahead of its time. That's an original feature, that disco ball with the little light bulbs and the silvery mirrors inside. It's something else. You don't see that. Now this is an aid to our imagination. So it's sometimes hard to look at these old buildings and imagine how impressive they once were, because they're all dwarfed now by taller buildings. So this is on the top, my own photograph across Lake Merritt from my visit last year to Oakland. And you can see that little spire there from Oakland City Hall. But now look how it dominated the skyline back when it was built. By the way, Lake Merritt is another thing that Mayor Mott brought to Oakland. He had that dredged out and enlarged. He wasn't perfect. I think the biggest flub that Mayor Mott committed was openly, publicly saying in the media, while mayor, that Oakland was a crummy name for the city and people needed to come up with a better one. He thought the city deserved something better and more descriptive than Oakland. This, of course, incensed the local newspaper, which this editorial sort of retorted to Mayor Mott. And memorably, this is what the newspaper editor said, quote, "Oakland would not sound so badly in connection with not and lot and rot and pot and stot and fought and hot and tot and swat and dot and jot and slot and bought or even shot. But Mott, perish the idea." Pretty good. Pretty funny writing from the newspaper 100 years ago. Oh boy. This is another skyscraper love story. This one's a little bit more risque. The guy there is William Daniels. So he's in charge of his father's department store in Denver. It's called Daniels and Fisher. His father founded it. And he's married and he's rich and he's bored. And he decides to go on an exploratory voyage. So he says goodbye to his wife in Denver and he sets sail for South America, ostensibly in search of gold and diamonds. And he doesn't find any, so he keeps on sailing up to England and London. And there he meets the London Geographical Society members, and they tell him they are planning an expedition to New Guinea. And he says, "Can I go with you guys if I pay for everything?" And they say, yes. So they set sail from London for Australia. And then while they're in Sydney, good old Mr. William Daniels meets this lovely young English noblewoman named Cicely Banner. And their eyes meet across a crowded room. And you're probably wondering what his wife in Denver is up to at this time. And around this time, she's filing divorce papers for desertion. But Cicely agrees to wait in Sydney while William finishes his exploration, and she does. 16 months later, he comes back from New Guinea, and they fall into each other's arms, and they sail back to London, and they're married. And of course, he's a rich department store owner, so they have a manor house in England, and they have a castle in France, and they have a big house in Denver, too, that they occasionally visit, not too often. But anyway, one time when they're in town, Daniels announces that what his department store really needs is a showstopper building that will make people come and visit. Now, around that time, in Venice, they're rebuilding the famous Campanile on St. Mark's. It had collapsed in 1902. So they were rebuilding it. And so William Daniels says, oh, that's what we need. We need a giant campanile from Venice, but with windows. And so they build it in 1911, and it's in the exact same dimensions as the one in Venice, with one difference. They make it 1 foot taller, because America, right? Marketing and bombast and so forth. I mean, like, look at those matches. That's pretty neat. I wish I could get a book of matches with the Daniels and Fisher Tower. So it's still there today. You recognize it maybe from the opening screen. I took that picture in my visit to Denver a couple years ago. Though what's not there is the department store it used to be attached to. That was torn down long ago. But this has been saved by the preservation movement in Denver. And if you look on the right there, that's the interior, the lobby. You can still see the original marble and brass fixtures and the detailed ceilings. In the background there, you can't quite make out everything, but that's a sign that it describes the cabaret theater show that they have down in the basement. Hope that's still going on now. Maybe it's temporarily suspended in COVID, but I'm sure that's a fun place to see a show. And then there are offices and so forth above, and up on top of the space behind those clock faces, you can rent that out for parties. One thing you can't see in this picture is William Daniels, but he's there. He said that he wanted to be buried in his store. And both of the lovers, Cicely and William, died in 1918 in the global pandemic, the influenza pandemic. So his urn is in the walls there somewhere. So I told you that the department store was demolished, by the way, for a new one further up the street there. And that's this. This is a big new department store complex it was the May Company had bought it by then. So it was May D&F. This is the 1950s. And they built this big sort of anodized aluminum gold colored blocky department store. And in front of it, you've got a hyperbolic paraboloid. And this was designed by a Chinese immigrant. This Chinese immigrant had studied architecture at MIT and Harvard. And of course, I'm talking about I.M. Pei, who's one of the most famous architects of the 20th century. And a couple of years ago, just passed away, lived to 102. This was one of his first big projects, Denver, this department store and a hotel that is next door. And this mini golf course is super. I mean, I have to say this. This image is marvelous, very 1950s. By the way, guess what? Developers don't have respect for any history, because you can't see this hyperbolic paraboloid in Denver anymore. It was also demolished in the name of progress in the 1990s, much to the chagrin of the preservationists there in Denver. The department store's frame is still there, and so is the hotel, but they've been altered and on and on. This is Arizona's first skyscraper, the Lures building in Phoenix. It's only 10 stories tall, so it's not towering or anything to us now, but in 1924, that was a big deal for Arizona. In fact, it's the first skyscraper in the state. And I mean, you can tell from the coverage there. Look at that. It says, "The Lighthouse of Phoenix Prosperity" on the Arizona Republican. I guess that's what the newspaper used to be called, not the Republic. And we see a new era in the capital city. So the young man there on the left, the person behind this venture, this skyscraper, is George Lures Jr. So George is a Phoenix native, and he's the son of German immigrants who owned a hotel in town. So he went to college at Stanford. He joined the army during World War I, but it ended before he could really get a chance to serve, get out of camp. So he went back to Stanford and he got his law degree as planned. But instead of practicing law, he almost immediately, this is a picture, by the way, of him at law school in Stanford when he got his JD. But he got his JD, practiced for about a year, and then jumped into a new project, which was to fulfill his father's lifelong dream to build a skyscraper. So this is the parents, Georg and Margaret Lures, at their wedding in America. He was raised in Germany and left home at the age of 20 to get out of serving in the army, and arrived in 1867 and immediately took a job in San Francisco. In New York, he read that there was a job he could do. He was trained as a wheelwright. That was the family business. So there was a job for people making carts and wheels, and the travel to San Francisco was covered. So he's one of the people that made it to San Francisco partly by boat, but then partly by mule, because they would cross the isthmus at Panama by mule. And then he tried out prospecting for a while too. That didn't work out. And eventually he found a job as a foreman in a gold mine in Arizona. And then he went on to open his own wagon shop and a stable, and eventually a hotel in Phoenix. And he went back to Germany and met a German girl from the hometown and brought her back to get to be his wife in America. They had 2 daughters and 2 sons. The sons went to college. Daughters were forbidden by dad. They couldn't even be teachers. He thought that was not a woman's place. But the family stayed close. They all went to the San Francisco World's Fair together, as a matter of fact. And the baby in this picture is little George Jr. He's dressed up for the visit of President William McKinley to Phoenix in 1901. At the time, the city's population was under 3,000 people. And he always remembered, his memoirs were not published, but you could find them in Phoenix in the library. And he talks about how he was, he remembers that the family would always talk about it. He was put in the president's lap. And as he grew up, he became an accomplished singer. He won a state singing contest as a high school kid. Played the violin, taught lessons to his friends, glee club at Stanford, and head, I think it was yeller they called it, but basically the cheerleader for the football team. 20 years after this picture's taken, that same little toddler now is a young man hustling around to find investors to fill up and pay for the first tall office building in Arizona. And he pulled it off. It didn't really make him rich. He actually lived most of his life across the street in the family hotel, which was a little 3-story hotel. He was single his whole life. He actually shared a bedroom with his widowed sister for decades. And there are strong hints in his memoirs that he was gay, though he doesn't actually say so much, and he was certainly not publicly out. But anyway, he and his brother, Arthur, ran the business their whole life, the hotel and the skyscraper. In fact, they built a second skyscraper. That's the third picture you see there. They're breaking ground. That's mom and dad breaking ground on the land of the former family home in Phoenix, where they're now building another Lures skyscraper, which was built in the Art Deco style, about the same size. And the proudest moment for George Jr. was 1968, he says, when they finally paid off all their debts and owned the building free and clear. He lived another 14 years. George is on the right in that photo, by the way, next to the sister. There's the Lures buildings now on either side of the block. Certainly handsome, even if they are not terribly tall. The original tenant on the top 4 floors were private, what was a private businessmen's club. And so even sometimes on the roof, they had boxing matches, apparently. Now, down below, this was for a time the Treasury agents' offices during Prohibition. So when they would seize illegal liquor, they would pour it down the drain in the basement, which makes it really fun now that the Lures building's ground floor has a very stylish and happening bar. It's called Bitter and Twisted. In fact, I'm using a Bitter and Twisted right now for my coaster, for my water mug here. Sadly, not a cocktail, but you can see me enjoying one there. That's the Bear Witness, which is, to give you some idea, Japanese rice whiskey, grapefruit, lemon, yuzu marmalade, and honey with pink peppercorns and a sprig of dill. Served, of course, in a plastic bear honey container you may recognize there. It's kind of that kind of bar. And they also make a really great Sazerac with chocolate. Um, Sazerac's a great drink. In fact, the hotel bar in New Orleans that claims to be the home of the Sazerac is also in my book. So if you like skyscraper cocktail stories, here's one more love story, and it's really the best one so far. The best one of all by far. It's Melly and Niels Espersen. Niels, on the left there, is another story of an immigrant who came to America hoping to find gold and never managed to do it. So he sailed over from Copenhagen as a 15-year-old in 1872. And he worked on a sheep farm in California, learned English, and he also studied geology, which he thought would help him find gold, but it didn't. So next thing he did was headed out to Oklahoma, where there was a big land rush on. And there he met a Kansas farm girl whose family had also come out for the big land rush, Melly Keenan. So Melly Keenan married Niels Espersen. They fell in love. They moved to Colorado right away, 1895, to prospect for gold. Niels told her, I've got it all figured out. Sadly, he was wrong. And not only did they not find any gold and blow up pretty much all their savings, but he got very sick with tuberculosis. So they abandoned ship, headed back to Kansas, where they lived with some of Melly's family. And I should mention, they were Christian Scientists. So Niels would not take any medical treatment for the tuberculosis that he had, but Melly helped nurse him back to health. And while he was recuperating, he read all he could about this new thing that was happening, drilling for petroleum. And he thought he'd had that figured out. And so they borrowed some money, moved down to Houston when he was better, and they put down some oil wells. And on their 5th try, they finally struck oil. And now they were rich. Espersen started the Invincible Oil Company, it was called. They drilled more than 200 wells and diversified into things like real estate and other stuff in Houston. And this was a business partnership too, by the way, unusual for the time, but the Espersens couldn't have children. And so instead they worked together as business partners. And so after they had become rich and started diversifying, they wanted to be real estate developers. And the first project they came up with was a movie palace called the Majestic Theater. And they opened that in 1923. And it's modeled really luxuriously to look like a Tuscan village. The ceiling, you can't tell in this black and white photo, but it's painted blue. And when the house lights went down, there were little twinkly lights in the ceiling to make it look like stars. And we've also learned that silent movies were anything but, right? So there's an orchestra pit there to accompany the films. And the next thing, once this was up and a big hit, the next thing the Espersens decided was, let's build a skyscraper. And they used the same architect, John Eberson. He had designed their theater. He was specialized in theaters. He'd never done a skyscraper. He had an office up in Chicago. So the Espersens went up to Chicago to talk with John Eberson and look at some buildings there and get some ideas. And while they were there at a theatrical performance one night, Niels got sick. And he felt so bad they left it at intermission. But they wouldn't see a doctor because they were Christian Scientists, and Niels refused. And perhaps predictably, certainly unfortunately, at age 65 that night, Niels died. And so Melly came back and built the skyscraper herself. And she named it after her husband, the Niels Espersen building. You can see it there on the left under construction. And in 1927, when this building opened, it was the tallest skyscraper, not just in Houston, but in Texas, which, as you all know, is really saying something. And I say she built it herself. I almost mean that literally. You can see her there on the right. That's at the groundbreaking, and she is working the steam shovel herself to dig up the dirt to break ground for the building. And she had a private balcony up on the roof where she could entertain guests. You can see there in the photograph. The building was kind of designed very much like the Wrigley building, which Niels and Melly had admired in Chicago, and is very theatrical with lots of urns and classical designs and so forth. Um, from there, from her balcony, Melly could see some of her holdings along the Houston Ship Channel, which she was also a serious partner investor in, until a rival business person, a businessman, built the building that you see behind it, the Art Deco-y building here. Quite a fancy and impressive looking structure, but it's also directly in the line of sight of the Houston Ship Canal so that you couldn't see it anymore. So the legend goes. But quite a beautiful building, the Niels Esperson building. And Melly Esperson remained for the rest of her life a very influential businesswoman in Houston. And she was in oil prospecting and production. They had rice farms. She started an industrial district and developed that, other real estate as well, active member of the Chamber of Commerce, certainly many social organizations. And she was once named the city's most successful businesswoman. And a nice thing about Houston, by the way, is all these mirrored skyscrapers. You can see on the left, that's up at the top, the observation area, which sadly is not public, but is quite lovely if you can find a way to go there. And those modern mirrored skyscrapers kind of make a nice reflection. So the photo on the back cover of my book, my author photo, is taken against one of those columns. By the way, I'm told that's the original paint job still. But you can see the reflection of the top of the Niels Esperson in the background of my little photo. And there's also a chime up there that Melly put in so that it chimes on the hour. And what I also wanted to draw your attention to on this story is next to the Niels Esperson building, towards the end of her life, Melly called up John Eberson, their architect, and said, "Would you please design another office, the Melly Esperson building? And it will stand side by side with the Niels Esperson building, but it'll be just a little bit shorter. All of the hallways match up. You can walk back and forth between the buildings." This time, though, Melly did not run the steam shovel because she had developed cataracts. And as a Christian Scientist, she staunchly refused any medical treatment. And so she was blind by the time her building was built in 1941, died about 4 years later. I can't help but imagine that Melly kind of considered that it was the way things were supposed to be, that since Niels never did get to see his skyscraper, she never did get to see hers. Oh, here's a great skyscraper story. This is very west. We were just in Texas. So now this one is in Vancouver, not even in the United States. Canada, by the way, credit where it's due. They were on board right from the get-go on skyscrapers, unlike Europe, where skyscrapers were looked at askance. I was going to say looked down upon, but they couldn't technically look down upon skyscrapers. Anyway, this is the postcard when it opened in 1912 said, "This is 270 feet tall, the tallest building in the British Empire," which kind of is comforting to see that even outside of America, people make empty boasts that are not true, because Liverpool has a taller building that opened in 1911. So it wasn't really the tallest building in the British Empire. It was the tallest building in Canada, you could say this building was, for about 3 years. Then it got passed up by a building in Toronto. Anyway, you can see on the left, it's the World Building. What makes it confusing is everyone in Vancouver knows it as the Sun Building, because shortly after it was built, its competitors bought it. There's financial difficulties arose and it had to be sold. So the Sun took over. No one calls it the World Building, except in my book where I like to call buildings by their original names. This is Lewis Taylor, publisher of the World, the Vancouver World newspaper, the owner originally, or rather the person who brought together the financing for the World Building. So briefly, the owner. He was always coming up with a scheme. Apparently, also, he loved baseball. He wasn't a Canadian. He was American. Well, he became Canadian, but he was born in Michigan. And in Chicago, he had a small bank where there was a financial scandal. His partner sort of took off, and Taylor spent a night in jail and realized that crisis was on its way. So instead, he bailed on Chicago, and jumped a train to Canada, leaving behind his wife and infant son, whom he sent for later. But still, he started out, he got to the coast and he started out trying prospecting in Canada. There was a gold rush on near Vancouver at first, and then the Yukon as well. Neither of those plans worked. He tried a bunch of different jobs. At one point, one thing that seemed to stick was working as a circulation manager for a newspaper. So he eventually decided he was going to buy a newspaper in Vancouver, the World. It was a struggling newspaper, and then he was going to use that as a way to catapult himself into a political power, just like George Hearst did in San Francisco. So he raised the money and built the skyscraper, and very soon he was elected mayor, but then he lost the next race for mayor, and he also lost his skyscraper to the sun. It's interesting, but Lewis Taylor is the winningest and losingest mayor in the history of Vancouver. He ran in 16 mayoral races over the course of his life, and he lost half and won half. At the end, people were so tired of him, even his old newspaper said, this is a quote during one of his many candidacies, "A vote for Taylor is a reckless plunge into the dark." He actually told his son in later years that the reason he ran for mayor is so that he could have an income. So eventually, some friends and acquaintances pooled their money together and got enough that he could have a little pension and live out the rest of his years in dignity. So this picture of him in an office of some luxury, that's the mayoral offices, but that is not how he spent his years out of office. Skyscrapers could cost a lot of money. In fact, this very building, the World/Sun building, is now in the midst of a 10 million Canadian dollar renovation project. And I was lucky enough to climb out there on the scaffolding when I visited. And it's very impressive, this building. This is the terracotta, and it's so high up in the air, much of it, that you wouldn't even be able to see it from the sidewalk. And this is just a demonstration of the craftsmanship that went into these antique skyscrapers, regardless of whether they were easily visible from sidewalk level. The weather's been really rough on that terracotta. Also, the steel inside is corroded in places. So that's a massive project. In the terracotta, I don't show you here, but there are 9 muses along the roof line that are somewhat controversial because, let's say, they're not wearing blouses. And some people commented that this was a reflection of Taylor, who kind of had a look the other way attitude when it came to brothels and vice in that port city. So I'm sitting on top of the cupola there. They're replacing all the roof tiles. Originally, they were tiles, standard tiles, porcelain, metal coated and I guess tile, but painted with a green color to look like copper. And now they're replacing it with sheets of real copper. So this was a great skyscraper visit. In fact, I actually have here, this is a roof tile from the World/Sun building in Vancouver. I don't know how I got this on a plane. It rings almost like it's metal. I guess I'm not a structural engineer, so I'm not entirely sure. It's hard for me to believe it's only earthen. So this was a great skyscraper visit, but I want to show you my absolute favorite antique skyscraper that I've seen in any of my travels. My number one favorite, and it's nearby, and it's in Seattle. It's called Smith Tower, and it was built for the Smith brothers. And you've probably heard of Smith Brothers cough drops. So this is not the same Smith Brothers. This is L.C. Smith and Brothers Typewriter Company. And you see them there. That's President Lyman Cornelius Smith on the left, and his brothers, vice presidents. Wilbert Smith is the vice president of manufacturing. Monroe Smith, the VP of sales. And there on the end is Hurlbut Smith, the vice president of finance. And Hurlbut has that look of shock and betrayal that you might expect from someone who was named Hurlbut. That was apparently the mother's maiden name, Hurlbut Smith. Well, Hurlbut, so he's Hurlbut Smith. Well, I guess she was heralded Smith as well. The Smiths didn't start out in the typewriter business. Their company eventually became half of Smith Corona. But they didn't start out in typewriters. They started out in an affiliated business of typewriters, shotguns. That does not sound right. That sounds crazy. But if you think about it, the first typewriter ever made was made by Remington, and that was also an arms manufacturer. So what's up with that? Gun factories have precision metal parts. They have sophisticated tools and skilled engineers, the sort of thing that you need to build complicated metal things, whether that's guns or typewriters. And frankly, once typewriters were invented, they were in much higher demand than guns were because of all the office workers and the paperwork and the clerical jobs that also made us need skyscrapers. Just like I love old newspapers, I love ad copy from the 1890s. Here's a Smith typewriter ad. The Smith Premier typewriter and happiness dwell together. No complicated devices to vex. So, Smith Premier Typewriter Company of Syracuse, New York, makes boatloads of money, and so President Lyman Smith decides he wants to build a skyscraper, which opens in 1914, and you can see it here in this 1915 stamp. Come see Seattle. That's that tall pointed tower in the center. And I feel like we've skipped an important detail, because why is it built in Seattle? It feels like a long commute from Syracuse, where Smith Typewriter is. Surprise! Yet another World's Fair. So most people, if you hear of the Seattle World's Fair, you think about the one in 1962, where they had the Space Needle and the famous building, the tall building in Seattle. But first they had a World's Fair in 1909, which was observing the anniversary of the Yukon Gold Rush. Well, close. I mean, it was 1897, the Gold Rush, but there was a little delay. So they got it in 1909. This is really the gold rush in the Yukon is how Seattle became a major city. It was supplied timber to San Francisco early on, but when it was the port city where everyone bought all the supplies they needed before sailing on for the Yukon, that's what really made Seattle boom. And the fair was held on the campus of the University of Washington, which, by the way, when the fair was first proposed, had only 3 buildings on it. But this was a good way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You could landscape and put new buildings down, and those that weren't temporary would help form a new campus. Plus, you get all that boostership of a World's Fair. Now, this L.C. Smith, Lyman Smith, had lots of holdings beyond the typewriter company. He had shipping companies in the Great Lakes, tons of real estate, and that included land here in Seattle that he had never seen before. But when he came out for the World's Fair, he saw it and he loved it. And he said, let's build a skyscraper there. And so they did. And I made you wait long enough to see Smith Tower. Smith Tower there, the tallest building on the West Coast for almost 50 years. And I had frankly never heard of it until I wrote my book. I bet many of you also haven't heard of Smith Tower. So why do I love it so much? A few reasons. Look at it, first of all. It's crazy. It's unique. There's no other building that looks like that. That's partly because the architects were also from Syracuse and they'd never made a skyscraper before. So in 1914, they were kind of winging it, and it looks like nothing else you'll find. And on the left there, you see it's the only antique skyscraper I know that has its own antique skyscraper theme song. The song is called Teardrop Windows, and it's by a Seattle musician named Ben Gibbard, which many of you may realize that's the frontman of a popular band, Death Cab for Cutie. So Teardrop Windows, the song imagines that those odd-shaped windows up on the pyramidal top of the building indicate that the Smith Tower is crying because it's no longer the tallest building in Seattle. There's the lyrics on the side. I won't read all of them, but it's sort of a sympathetic story for someone interested in antique skyscrapers, because they all go through this period where they are firmly out of fashion and vacant on most of their floors and maybe endangered. Someone would like to tear them down and build something better. And I would play it for you now, except Zoom meetings are not a good place for to listen to audio. So, but I urge you, seek out teardrop windows after this talk and give it a listen. Look, there's the building. He's imagining, the Gibbard writes that the building is watching the sunset over Puget Sound and remembering when it was a big deal, and then the problem. But in 1962, the needle made its big debut and everybody forgot what it outgrew. Of course, Smith Tower. Of course, Smith Tower, outgrown by the Space Needle, no longer the tallest building on the West Coast. But before you feel too sorry for this poor crying office building, I would like you to know it kind of had it coming, because it was a very vain building. It still is a very vain building. What do I mean? It lies about its height. So from the very beginning, once Smith announced he was building a skyscraper, they said that the skyscraper would be 42 stories tall. And the website, if you go to Smith Tower's website now, it says that it's 42 stories tall. The little souvenirs you can get in the souvenir shop there, 42 stories tall. Take a moment and count the floors there. I'll wait. You can see the ground level from here. It's nowhere near 42 stories tall. It's basically somewhere in the 30s. I mean, even if you count those top stories right up here, which, by the way, those are ornamental windows. The teardrop windows, until very recently, basically hid a water tower or a water tank for the rest of the building. It turns out recently the tank was removed and it's been turned into a penthouse, which is something else I'm sure I have not had a chance to see. But yeah, not 42 stories tall, no matter how you slice it. But still, I love it. I mean, I love that it has a family-friendly museum of typewriters where they let me type up the first draft of the book there on an old Smith typewriter model. I had to learn to type faster for the book. I love that the lobby has such rich decoration. Some of the warmest marble, honey colored almost, that I've seen in onyx trim. You can see there in the mirror, the reflection is carved chieftains, like Native Americans with feather headdresses, which may not be PC, it was pretty neat. And look at that carved bench as well. And then the elevators that you can see there in the mirror with the heads over them. I love that it still has its original human operated elevators. So this, I haven't encountered these almost anywhere else. There's no other skyscraper in my book that I know of that has the original elevator. Those are the original elevators. They've been updated a little bit. You can see this panel of buttons. By the way, notice the top button, which takes you to the observatory at the top, is numbered 35, not 42. But anyway, I guarantee you that this gentleman here had to push a little lever to make us go up. And on top, there's a gorgeous lounge and a restaurant, still with the original decoration, which was Chinese style, the Chinese theme. So this was actually made in America, but with the theme of Chinese decoration. And they serve great cocktails. We've established that I like a good cocktail. That's the man Mrs., by the way. And this was our first trip to the Pacific Northwest just over a year ago, I guess. Well, a little more than a year ago. We arrived there just about the same time that coronavirus arrived there. So it was an adventure, but we soldiered on and had a beautiful time. And while we're enjoying those cocktails, we can look out the picture windows that wrap around the entire observatory on the top of the Smith Tower, where you can see the Seattle skyline and all those new skyscrapers there. You can see Pike Place. You can see Puget Sound. You can see the Cascades to the east, and to the west you see the Olympic Mountains and the peninsula. And if the clouds are obliging, you can see Mount Rainier. In fact, about the only thing you cannot see from the Smith Tower Observatory is the Space Needle, which seems just about right. And if you want to dare, you can step outside of that nice cozy bar to the open air platform that wraps 360 degrees around the bar and get an even more spectacular view. So I'm going to go ahead and show you this video that I took, and you'll have to forgive me because it's, you know, Zoom lecture and so forth, but I want to give you some sense of what it's like looking at the skyline and the surroundings from the top. Look up there, you can see those teardrop windows, which is now a penthouse, as I said. Oh, it's a little windy. Those are the Cascade Mountains. So there I'm looking west and now sort of tipping to the south. You can see the sports stadium where the Seahawks play. Now what I'm trying to do is figure out, where's Mount Rainier? There it is. It's immense. Completely dwarfs all the other mountains. And then of course you've got, if you tip over this way to the west, that's Puget Sound. The boat's heading out across to the Olympic Peninsula. Those mountains are in the distance, you can see as well. That little Ferris wheel is right next to the aquarium, and that's where Pike Place is. Looking up there to the north, can't see the Space Needle. That's where it would be. So that's it. That's my presentation, the best antique skyscrapers of the West. I hope you've enjoyed this virtual tour and the histories of these amazing skyscrapers and their builders, the people that ordered them up, the tycoons and so forth. If you did enjoy it, I highly recommend a copy of the book, Multi-Stories. You could get it at my website, which is hausertalks.com. You'll find other fun stuff there as well. And there's links, so you could get it on Amazon as well. Thank you very much.